I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our investigation into the case of Darlie Routier. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my unimpeachable co-host, Alice.
Are you saying that just because we got lots of mean reviews about me?
That's, well, you know, we don't listen to those people, Alice. They don't know what they're talking about.
Words hurt, y'all. Use them wisely. There are some mean people out there. It's okay.
I don't
still
think
love
those
most
people
of
actually
y'all.
listen. I think they just make it up, you know? Anyway.
Well, that was
just know we don't
very
care what you
nice.
think, so.
And I'm definitely not unimpeachable. As we know, anyone can be impeached, basically, on cross-examination, so.
Whatever, Alice. I don't think you could be successfully impeached. And I think that's the key that we're going for here. People can try, but they fail. Because you are unimpeachable. Well, everybody, we are back to talk more about Darlie Routier in this tragic case. You know, it's funny. I really hate cases involving the death of children, and yet I feel like these days all we do are cases about the death of children. Not sure how we got on this, but I will tell you this. The next case we're going to do is not going to be about children dying. We're skipping whatever. We're pushing them off for a while. We're going to do some less... I mean, they're all tragic cases, but some less tragic cases than we've been doing lately.
I appreciate it, Brett. It's very emotionally taxing for me, I will say.
It is. It's incredibly taxing, but, you know, we try and do what you want to hear, and you're very interested in this case, and so we decided we wanted to do it too, and it is an interesting one. Last time we talked a lot about some of the evidence in this case. We sort of set up the case and then went through some of the things that people point to who believe that Darlie is guilty. We're going to start today with a little bit of the other side of the ledger. The one piece of evidence that I think a lot of people point to is the most convincing evidence of Darlie's, other than her own injuries, which we're also going to talk about later, and that is this sock. You've heard us mention it a couple times. If you are familiar with this case, you know exactly what we're talking about. If you're not familiar with it, you may be thinking, why do you keep mentioning this sock? What is this sock? What does this sock have to do with this case? And it actually is a really, really interesting piece of evidence, unlike anything I think I've seen in any other case.
I think that's right, Brett. I mean, let's talk about this sock. So there is a blood-stained sock that was found 75 yards from the Routier home. Now, Darlie claimed that this proved she didn't commit the crime and proved an intruder had fled and somehow left the sock behind. The prosecution and police claimed that Routier planted the sock. So which one is it? So let's look at the facts to try and figure out what this means. The sock contained blood from Devin and Damon. The bloodstains are in two different locations on the sock, and there is no blood connecting the two spots of blood. The blood themselves were described by the expert at trial as consistent with very light transfer, rather than blood falling onto the sock like soaking it through. In other words, it seems as though the sock touched a pool of blood rather than blood from an injury spurting onto it. One blood stain was on the sole of the sock. The other was on the side of the sock. And neither of the stains would be visible on someone wearing a shoe. And it's difficult to imagine how someone wearing a shoe could have gotten blood on the sock in these two locations. So think about it. Let's imagine that this sock is worn by an intruder who probably came into the house with shoes on. The sole and the sides of the socks would be covered by a shoe. So how would the blood get into the shoe onto it? And let's say the person didn't have a shoe. They were barefoot. You would think that if they stepped in a pool of blood, all the blood would be, say, on the ball of the foot or the sole of the foot. How would the side occur? What if the perpetrator wore the sock as a glove instead of on his foot? According to the expert who testified at trial, if worn as a glove, you would expect to see blood from the person who offered the greatest resistance, in this case, Darlie Routier. But, in fact, there was no blood from Darlie on the sock. Her DNA, however, was on the sock. If Darlie were in a life and death struggle with the assailant, a man who was wearing a sock to hold a bloody weapon that had her blood on it, with an almost fatal neck wound and severe defensive wounds, how is it possible that she could transfer her DNA to the sock and not her blood?
This is a really interesting piece of evidence because I feel like it's almost a Rorschach test for how you see this case. If you see this case and you think Darlie is innocent, you see this sock as proof of that, because how could the sock have ended up so far away? What are the chances that Darlie would have gone and planted that sock somewhere? If you think Darlie's guilty, you see this as evidence of her guilt. And I do think it's really interesting to sort of walk through this. So the sock came from the Routier house. We know that. So it's not, this is not an unknown sock. If it were, that would be much better for Darlie. If this sock had come from outside the house, obviously this is the one that would make it the one piece of evidence that came from outside the home. Remember, we've already talked about this. The murder weapon came from inside the home. Arguably, the knife used to cut the screen came from inside the home. There's no real evidence of anyone being inside the home. So if this sock had been a foreign sock, then all of a sudden you have evidence of an intruder. It's not. It's also from inside the home. And this whole idea that it was worn as a glove, as Alice said, it's pretty clear nobody was wearing it. Like, this guy didn't stop and put the sock on at some point. So if you think it's an intruder, you probably think that they wore it as a glove. And in fact, there was, and you hear about this some, and we'll probably talk about this later, there was a rapist in Dallas at the time who occasionally did use socks as gloves. And so some people think, well, maybe it's the same guy, even though it's a suburb of Dallas, but there's no evidence this person was ever active outside of the Dallas metro area. But nevertheless, you could imagine, well, maybe they used it as a glove. The problem with that is you would expect to see their DNA on the sock then. Like, if they just stuck their hand in the sock, you would expect to see their DNA. You don't see that. So you actually have to think that this person was wearing gloves and then wore the sock too, which really doesn't make any sense. I mean, I just want you to imagine wearing a glove, wearing a sock over the glove, and then holding a knife. Just think about that. Think about how hard it would be to actually hold that knife. The knife with essentially two different layers of fabric in between you and the knife, and you're going to try and stab a couple people with this. You're going to fight with somebody over this. I mean, it would actually be pretty difficult, and it doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? Like, you don't want to get your gloves dirty? I mean, I don't really understand what your purpose would be.
And if you're taking things from the house, because remember, the sock is from the house, if you're grabbing a knife from the kitchen, why not grab like a dishwashing glove, if there is one? But there's probably some sort of glove in that area, or just grab a dishcloth as opposed to a whole sock that wraps your whole hand. If your point is just to wrap something around the handle, they're kind of better grips you can have.
Yeah, the sock as a glove really seems strange to me. Another thing, why take the sock with you? You didn't take the knife with you. Why not throw down the sock where you threw down the knife? It doesn't really make any sense. It's presumably the reason you don't take the knife with you is because taking the knife outside of that home ties you to the crime. So all you had to do was drop the sock, and then you're done with the sock and you go on about your business. But instead, you carry the sock with you for 75 yards to dispose of it in the street. Why would you do that? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Darlie, it's interesting because the police think she did this. They think that she dropped this sock. Some people have said, Well, it would be more consistent with someone who's just trying to stage a scene to just throw it in the backyard, right? And we actually have seen this before with our friend Jeffrey McDonald. That's exactly what he did. He took the knives that were used in the murder of his family and threw them in the backyard to make it seem like it was an intruder. Obviously, somebody figured out pretty quick that that's what he did. This is actually much more effective. And it's much more effective, and it's worked, right? If Darlie did this, it was genius. And from this point forward, it has worked for her and has been a piece of evidence that people have pointed to. The fact that none of her blood is on this sock is crazy if you think if the intruder is responsible for this sock. How is that possible? That was a big piece of testimony at the trial that I think people just kind of gloss over, that there's no blood from her on the sock. I mean, it doesn't even make sense how that's possible. The killer has stabbed 3 different people and there's only blood from 2 different people on the sock. The theory for the prosecution is that Darlie has already stabbed the kids. It's unclear. I mean, they don't have an exact theory on how the blood got on the sock. I think a lot of people think she would have taken the sock and sort of dipped it in the blood of both kids, and that's why there's some blood over here and some blood over there, because she's dipping, different parts of the sock in the blood to get the blood on there. She then plants the sock, then she comes back, she stabs herself. So the reason there's none of her own blood on it is because stabbing herself is essentially the last thing she does. She stabs herself, she calls the police, and that gives her the best chance of surviving, and that's why there's no blood on the sock. And whatever you think about this case, and whether you think she actually did this and ran 75 yards into the darkness to drop this sock off, it is certainly more consistent with the prosecution's theory than it is with the theory of an intruder.
And think about this, if Darlie already had sustained her injuries, and not only would blood likely be on the sock, but if she had already sustained it and was somehow running after with the sock, you would think there'd be a trail of blood somewhere, right? There would be blood somewhere connecting to the sock, and there's none of that. And the fact that the blood is not even connected within on the sock is very suspect, because usually these attacks are wild, right? They're not planned. You're probably struggling all over, and it would be very difficult, I think, to keep 2 different blood pools from touching each other if you are using the sock as a glove, as a sock, as any other sort of device in carrying out your murders.
And there's blood all over the knife. And so you would expect, if you're holding that knife with the sock, wherever there's blood on the knife, there's going to be blood on the sock. I mean, there should be lots of blood on the sock. It's another thing about the sock. There's not a lot of blood on it. It's not like a blood-soaked sock. There's blood on a couple different places, which just doesn't fit with someone using this as a glove. One thing I considered is like, I don't know, the world's greatest static electricity, like the sock sticks to the guy's, his like leg or something, like his pants, and gets some blood on it, and then just sort of falls off as he's leaving. I don't know. I mean, I think that's sort of the best thing you can do for how this sock would be associated with the intruder. And this is one of those things, there's a lot of these in this case, where when you first look at it, it seems like, well, this really helps Darlie. There's a sock from the crime scene, 75 feet away. Only the intruder could be responsible for that sock. But then you look more closely at it, and it kind of starts to fall apart. And then you're like, how in the world could an intruder have been responsible for that sock? Why would they leave it there? Why would it only have the blood it has on it? Now look, if Darlie did this, this is a high-stakes, high-risk thing to do. She would have gone out into the night. Anyone could have seen her. If they saw her, her cover is blown, her story is destroyed. But this is a high-risk murder if she did it. And we're going to talk about later her injuries. If she inflicted those injuries on herself, those were high-risk injuries that she inflicted. So, yeah, it definitely would be if she did this, but I don't know that that's entirely inconsistent with the overall picture of this case. Well, Alice, before we continue, I want to talk about one of my favorite podcasts in the world, Big Mad True Crime. About the only good thing that came from having to drive 2 hours a day to the hospital was catching up on Big Mad True Crime with Heather Ashley. And I have to tell you, it is one of the most awesome podcasts I've ever heard. I love it. I love everything about it. And I want all you guys to listen.
Brett, I know. When you discovered it, I think you texted me immediately and I said, "What's it about?" You said, "Heather Ashley tackles big cases, little cases, everything in between." And what I really love about it is that, we oftentimes talk about the respect that needs to be paid to the victims. And boy, does Heather do that. She really respects the victims as she tells their stories and doesn't lose sight of who these stories are actually about.
And I'll tell you what, she doesn't hold back on the people responsible for the crime she covers either. She tells it like it is. She's straightforward, and you know what you're going to get from Heather Ashley. So check out Big Mad True Crime wherever you get your podcast and get big mad about true crime. So a couple small things that if you read through the transcript, you'll see. This was a fairly long case. There were a lot of witnesses called. You hear sort of the bare bones of this story when you listen to podcasts and documentaries about this. But there were just little things that happened in this case that were interesting. One thing that's interesting is the dog. There was a dog at this home. Darlie had a dog. He was known to bark at any person who didn't live in the house. The dog was actually asleep upstairs with Darren that night, and he actually did not start barking until the police showed up. Now, it's possible, certainly, that he slept through whatever was going on downstairs, but I think it is interesting. I don't think it's definitive of anything because the dog could have slept through it. I find it hard to believe. I have a dog. The dog sleeps with us. I have a really difficult time believing my dog would sleep through anything like this, but it is a possibility. But one thing we can say for certain is the dog did not bark.
Yeah, I mean, especially if this dog intimately knows the movements of people within the house. My dogs don't move when someone else in the house who lives in the house moves because they know their movements, they know kind of the sound of those people, and they know the smell. And for this dog who normally barks to not have barked, I think is a very important piece of information.
It's actually one of the worst things about having a dog. It's the best thing and the worst thing. The dog sleeps at the foot of the bed, and if there's a noise, the dog hears it, and the dog sits up and listens, right? And it'll be in the middle of the night, and it always wakes me up too, and I'm like, is there actually something out there or not? And so I sort of sit there, and then finally the dog lays his head down, and I'm like, okay, we're good. Go back to sleep.
And this actually reminds me of a time, I lived in the middle of a very big city. There were always people walking in and out outside of our house. I mean, there's no way that there wasn't a lot of foot traffic. And my dog, for the most part, would leave them alone. However, one day I was at home and it was the middle of the day. I think I may have been on maternity leave or something. And my German Shepherd was going crazy. I mean, would not stop barking. And this is not her usual nature. And it was the middle of the day. I want to say it was 11 a.m. And there were people walking outside, but she wasn't focused on them. She kept looking at the backyard and barking her head off. And I could not get her to stop. I kept pulling her away. She wouldn't. And finally, I went upstairs so I could get a better vantage point of what was happening outside. And there was a man standing at my gate, which was quite a distance away. The gate was at the end of my very small backyard, but still a backyard. So it was not near my door. He was a good, I don't know, maybe 20 yards or so away and standing at the gate motionless. He didn't move. And that's what my dog was barking at. He knew that there was someone at the gate who shouldn't have been there. And the guy, I watched him and he was motionless for, 5-10 minutes. And finally, when the dog would not start barking, he turned around and walked down the alley. Now, maybe he was confused and thought this was his house, but I will say my dog knew the difference and that wasn't even close to inside my house. Here we have an alleged intruder coming into the house to attack 3 members of the family and the dog makes no motion.
Yeah, it's really, like I said, not saying it's anything definitive, but it's an interesting little tidbit about this case that was brought up at trial. The other thing, there's a motion light in the backyard. The Routiers had a motion sensor light. Remember, this person, if they came into the house, they would have came in the backyard, cut the screen, and gone inside. Tests determined that someone coming through the backyard to the screen or vice versa, so leaving the backyard as well, would set off that light. And the light was determined to stay on for 18 minutes. But the officers who responded to the scene both testified that the light was not on when they arrived. And we've talked about this timeline before. We talked about, how long could Damon have lived? Was he alive at the time? If you believe he was alive when the paramedics arrived, that is actually a problem for Darlie, because given that tight timeline, it would seem to require that the intruder was incredibly lucky somehow and did not trigger the motion light upon exiting the home.
If anything, I would say my motion sensor lights are overactive, like a squirrel passing by sets them off.
No, I mean, that's been my experience as well. And when the police officers that night went into the backyard, the motion sensor light came on. So it certainly was working that night.
Well, these are just a few of the unusual factors, but there's more. At trial, the prosecution put on evidence that someone moved the vacuum cleaner after the murders. Tom Bevel was a forensic expert and crime scene investigator. He testified that there was blood on the vacuum cleaner consistent with the vacuum cleaner standing upright. There were also blood drops consistent with the vacuum cleaner lying on the floor. There was a blood stain on the handle, and there were roll marks near the kitchen sink that were consistent with someone rolling the vacuum cleaner through the blood. In fact, the roll marks were consistent with someone rolling the vacuum cleaner backwards and forwards through the blood. None of this makes any sense given Darlie's story. She would have had no reason to move the vacuum cleaner, and the killer certainly didn't, do a little cleaning up afterwards. Darlie's defenders claim that the crime scene technicians moved the vacuum cleaner, but honestly, I can't actually find any evidence that is true. Now, even if the crime scene technicians did move the vacuum cleaner, and at some point technicians will often move things after they have photographed the crime scene in the way that they find it, because they don't have laser vision to see the blood beneath it without moving it, but they usually take a photo of what the scene looks like when they arrive, and then they will document that they've moved a piece to be able to take a photograph of whatever is underneath it. It still doesn't explain the totality of the evidence. For example, why would the technicians move the vacuum cleaner forward and backwards, and why would bloodstains be on the handle? The technicians would be wearing gloves. They wouldn't have blood on them. So the blood marks on the vacuum cleaner itself cannot be explained with the technicians moving the vacuum cleaner after the fact.
And I think we talked about this with the Jeffrey McDonald case. It's almost textbook. If you're doing a wrongful conviction, if you're arguing that your client was wrongfully convicted, you're always going to argue that the crime scene was completely compromised and there were too many people there and the technicians moved things. You're going to say all those things, and sometimes that's more true than others. But I think one thing you really have to do when you're looking at this, and if you want to be careful about this, remember, these are advocates. I think that's one thing that's really important to remember for everybody out there in the true crime world. Yes, the Innocence Project does a lot of good work, but they're the Innocence Project, right? Their thing is finding people that they think might have been wrongfully convicted and proving that they're innocent. And so they are advocates for that. They are wanting to advocate on behalf of the people whose cause they've taken up, and they're going to look at things under a certain light. And so when they see this vacuum cleaner thing, maybe it was moved, and maybe that does explain part of the evidence. Maybe they moved it back and forth, and that's why there are roller marks in the blood. But like Alice said, that doesn't explain everything about the vacuum cleaner. And one reason I think we know that it wasn't really the crime scene technicians, Darlie, in subsequent statements and even at trial, talks about this vacuum cleaner, and really her story, one of two things is happening with Darlie. Her story changes, it gets more complex over time. Maybe she's just remembering things, maybe she's just telling a more fulsome story, but at times it seems like she's adding things to address things that have come up. So this vacuum cleaner thing comes up. And so Darlie talks about how she was leaning on the vacuum cleaner and she was using the vacuum cleaner as kind of a crutch, and maybe she knocked the vacuum cleaner over. So she's trying to give sort of an explanation of how the blood got on the vacuum cleaner. This is a late addition to her story, but it fits with sort of what the crime scene techs are seeing. And that's the thing. You got to look at the whole thing. Maybe her story is true, But she certainly felt like she needed to explain some aspects of this that cannot be explained just by saying some tech moved the vacuum cleaner. And I really didn't find any evidence either that that's what caused this. It's another thing people just sort of assert, but I'm not sure where it comes from. In any event, that is not the only crime scene problem for Darlie. Another problem is the broken glass. And I think this is a piece of evidence that in listening to podcasts after doing some research on this case, I was kind of surprised I didn't hear that much about, because I thought this was pretty interesting. So Darlie, in her statement, in her very first statement, claims that she heard glass breaking soon after awakening from the attack on her. So you remember she is awakened by her son, who's sort of crying and touching her. She wakes up, she sees this guy walking away, she hears this glass breaking. She then begins to follow him. And we know what this glass was. It was a wine glass that was shattered on the floor. But here's what's interesting about the glass. The glass was found on top of Darlie's bloody footprints. If her story is true, how did it get there on top of her own footprints before she entered the kitchen? Remember, her story is she woke up, she hears glass breaking, then she gets up. But the glass is on top of the bloody footprints. Her defenders are going to fall back on this. The techs messed up the scene thing again, and so they must have somehow moved the glass onto the bloody footprints. But once again, there's no evidence that this happened, and this is weird. Moving the vacuum cleaner is one thing. Knocking the vacuum cleaner over, moving the vacuum cleaner around so you can get better pictures. That makes sense to me. I can see that. I can imagine someone doing that and it causing a problem in the future. Why would you move the glass? I mean, are they like sweeping glass around the kitchen? I mean, that doesn't even make sense, particularly given that the glass is an important part of the story. But what's even more interesting about this is the glass, it's on the kitchen floor. It's between the family room and the kitchen sink. Now, Darlie, in her initial story, that's not a problem. She hears the glass breaking. She follows the guy. He disappears. She screams. Her husband comes down. She puts a towel on the back of Damon. She calls the police. Not an issue, right? But as we're about to talk about, there's a problem for Darlie because the sink in the kitchen shows scenes of being cleaned. The excuse that Darlie uses for that is that she was going back and forth into the kitchen, wetting towels, and then bringing those towels into the family room to help with the kids. But the problem is the glass is in between the family room and that sink. And in fact, the glass was sharp. It was so sharp that one of the detectives actually cut his hand on one of the shards as he was collecting the pieces. He testified to that fact. And yet Darlie had not a cut on the bottom of her feet. So somehow, if her story is true, she traveled in between the family room to the sink, through where this glass would have been, did not cut her foot, but the glass is nevertheless on top of her own bloody footprints.
Let's talk more about that kitchen too, Brett. Blood covered most of the kitchen except for one place, the kitchen sink. When police applied luminol to it, this is, by the way, a true crime cliche alert, the sink lit up like a Christmas tree. Here's the testimony of Detective Lynch when asked what he saw upon looking at the sink. Quote, "It was unusual. There were some stains that appeared to be watered down that had run into the stainless steel areas that were positive for blood. The blood stains on the front of the cabinet were such that when that blood was being shed, it would also need to be shed into the sinks, which were now clean. So it was my opinion that the sinks had probably been cleaned of blood. The faucet and handles appeared clean, but were also reactive for the presence of blood. With the chemicals we use, if blood is present, it will pop up a green color, kind of a blue-green. If the blood is fresh, it will react very quickly and a very bright blue-green. If the blood is old, you'll get kind of a dull, light green color." Lynch testified that these stains were, quote, "quickly and darkly reactive." In other words, it was fresh blood. Darlie's defenders have vehemently argued that when Darlie was getting towels, she wet them in the sink. Darren would testify that after Darlie went to get towels, he heard water running, supporting this idea. Now, this makes no sense, of course, but Darlie's state of shock covers many sins in this case.
Can we talk about this for a second?
Sure, yeah.
Why would you wet the towels before you used them? I mean, the whole point of the towels is you want to put pressure, stop the bleeding. Exactly. Like, the wet towels thing makes no sense at all.
You only wet towels to wipe things up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? It doesn't really make any sense. You can just say, well, Darlie was in shock. And I think that's, I guess what people would say. And so she wasn't thinking, so she was wetting these towels. But it makes no sense that she would be doing that.
And Brett, you know what we see a lot in our crime scenes is, you just said it, the point of the towels was to put pressure. But actually, when people are in a state of shock and they see a lot of blood, their thought is put pressure, but also to soak up the blood. Because somehow if you soak up the blood, there won't be any more blood. And that's why you use dry towels. I'm not saying it makes sense, but this is kind of the initial shock. There's so much blood, we got to soak it up. And so it doesn't make sense, even in a state of shock, to be wetting the towel so that they can't soak up the blood.
Yeah, I mean, people even, and I've thought about this in the Michael Peterson case, people even will clean. It's like they're cleaning up the blood. It's a weird thing that people do because they are in shock.
Psychologically, they think if they get rid of the blood, they can help save the person, right? If there's no blood, then it's not as bad as it looks like, even though obviously the problem is that the person is bleeding.
Yeah, and this does not fit with that, and it's just so convenient. Where this again, not in her initial statement. Her initial statement doesn't say anything about going back and forth, wetting towels. There's nothing about that. But once it became obvious that the sink was clean, all of a sudden there needed to be a reason for that. Why is the blood all washed away in the sink? Well, I was back and forth at the sink, wetting towels. How she did that without cutting her feet? Unclear. Why she would do that? Also unclear. And also inconsistent with the evidence you actually see at the scene.
Yeah, and, let's say she's in this state of shock, and for some reason in her state of shock, she thinks it's a good idea to wet the towel before she puts it on her children. Note that the towel she was holding against her own throat to stop the bleeding was dry. That one wasn't wet down with water, and there's no evidence of diluted blood anywhere else in the home, nor were there any wet spots on the floor, both of which you'd expect to find if she were wetting towels in the sink and then taking it to wipe up the blood or to stop the blood of her sons. So those two things don't make any sense. I don't know about you, Brett, but whenever I'm trying to wipe up spilled milk or spilled water, in the kitchen when my kids knock over a cup, I'll grab a rag, wipe it up. There's water dripping everywhere because a soaked rag drips water. And here we have none of that. No other wet spots on the floor from dripping wet towels.
Yeah, this is another one of those things that you can say it and you can say, well, see, that explains it. She was wetting the towels. Yeah, but what would be the consequences of that? You would see some evidence of that, and you don't see that. And that's significant to me.
We talk about Occam's razor a lot, and this is Darlie's story, and the defense's story really seems like the opposite of Occam's razor. It's doing all this mental gymnastics to make the crime scene work for their story when really it looks like, in this case, someone cleaned up the sink. And there's more evidence that someone cleaned up, more than just the sink. Lynch testified that the evidence under the sink supported the idea that someone had cleaned up. So I'm going to read you his colloquy in court. The question: did you have any opportunity to look at the cabinet under the sink? Yes, sir. Was the blood on the outside of the cabinet consistent with having been deposited when the doors were closed? Yes. Was there also blood on the inside that was consistent with having been dropped while the doors to the cabinet were actually open? Yes. Do you remember what was inside that cabinet? As I recall, it was the usual under-the-sink kitchen cleaning materials, cleanser and stuff. A transfer blood stain was found on the cabinet door, indicating that someone with a bloody hand had opened it. So, think about Lynch's testimony. There's blood on the outside and the inside. And you know what's inside the cabinet? Cleaning materials, as you would expect under the sink. And what do you use cleaning materials for? Cleaning. And we have evidence of there have been cleaning of at least the sink.
Yeah, and I don't know how this fits with the towels. I mean, obviously an intruder didn't do this. I don't, even if the towel story explains why the sink is clear of blood, this part doesn't make any sense. And this is another one of those things that when you read through the transcript, you see it, but nobody really talks about. And I feel like this is really powerful. This is really powerful evidence that someone that night was cleaning the area. I don't know why they were doing it. I don't know what the purpose was. I think the theory probably is that if Darlie applied these wounds to herself, cut her own throat, she probably did it at the sink. And she did it at the sink. She's bleeding all over the sink. And for some reason, she decides that's bad. She needs to clean it up. I don't know. I don't know why that happened. I don't know why there was cleaning. The only thing I can say for sure is the intruder didn't clean. And we know the intruder didn't clean because Darlie tells us as much. Darlie tells us what happens after she wakes up, when the intruder leaves. He doesn't stop at the sink to clean up. He heads out the door. So you can't have it both ways. If you believe Darlie's story, then this is a massive hole that you have to try and figure out. And I hate to keep going back to Jeffrey McDonald, but there are so many similarities between Jeffrey McDonald and this case. You may recall, in that case, Jeffrey McDonald's blood was found in front of the cabinet in the sink where the gloves were kept, where the latex gloves were kept. And it was the same gloves that were used to write pig on the headboard. And the fact that his blood was there indicated that he went to the kitchen, got the glove, and then wrote pig on the headboard. And you got a similar thing here. The fact that the blood is found inside the cabinet indicates that somebody was inside the cabinet cleaning, and the only person who would have done that, you would think, is Darlie.
Brett, before we move on, I have to say I am so excited that HelloFresh is one of our sponsors because, as you know, life is so busy between the podcast, working full-time as prosecutors, and being a parent to 2 little kids. Getting healthy food on the table each night is really a struggle, but no longer with HelloFresh, because HelloFresh cuts out the stressful meal planning and grocery store trips with less prep, less effort, and minimal cleanup so that you can enjoy cooking and get dinner on the table in just about 30 minutes. And you know, HelloFresh's produce gets from the farm to your door in less than a week. I love that. I love that it's always fresh ingredients. And this is high quality, and I can tell you my kids gobble up everything I make from HelloFresh.
And Alice, you didn't warn me about how much harder it is to have 2 kids instead of 1. So I really appreciate HelloFresh and the ability to choose from 50 menu and market items each week, from vegetarian meals to craft burgers and extra special gourmet options, which are all available. There's something for everyone to enjoy, with all recipes designed and tested by professional chefs and nutritional experts to ensure deliciousness and simplicity. My wife and I made the crispy Parmesan chicken recently, and it was absolutely delicious. And now that Green Chef is owned by HelloFresh, there's an even wider array of meal plans to choose from. There's something for everyone, and I love switching between the brands, and I'm glad that both brands sponsor this podcast, and I hope everyone will check them out.
So go to HelloFresh.com/TP14 and use code TP14 for up to 14 free meals plus free shipping. Go to HelloFresh.com/TP and use code TP14. Find out for yourself why HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit.
And that's not the only role that blood plays in sort of telling the story of this case. This is another case where we have cast off. We heard about cast off until we were sick of cast off when we were talking about the Michael Peterson case, and you have it here as well. And frankly, as it often does in cases involving stabbings, you're going to see cast off because the person is stabbing someone, they're removing the blade. When they remove the blade, blood is going to be cast off from that blade and is going to tell part of the story. So blood pattern analysis, it has its detractors. We're not saying it doesn't. It can be manipulated, absolutely. So take all that into account when you're thinking about this evidence. But Bevel, who was a crime scene expert, we've talked about him before, testified that there were blood stains on the back of Routier's shirt that were consistent with cast off from a knife. So the blood was from the boys. And Bevel testified it was consistent with Routier leaning over them, stabbing them, withdrawing the knife from the victim in an upward fashion, and casting the blood off the knife over her right shoulder and down the back of her shirt. And there were stains consistent with cast off from both victims on the front part of her shirt. Now, Darlie will say, look, of course I had blood from my kids on me. I was trying to save them. That's where it comes from. And that's really where this whole cast off thing comes in. Do you believe it was cast off? Do you believe it was contact? If you believe it's cast off, it's bad for Darlie. If you believe it's contact, maybe you can explain it. The problem for Darlie is the blood on the back of her shirt. How did she get the blood on the back of her shirt if this is from something she's doing to help the boys? You can sort of understand the blood on the front of her shirt, but how did she get blood on the back of her shirt?
And remember, cast-off patterns look different than contact pattern, right? Think of if you're holding a wet paintbrush and you throw it up, you'll see kind of the droplets all over up the wall, kind of like a semicircle. Whereas if you take that same soaked paintbrush and stick it on a piece of paper, the water spreads, right? So these experts are looking at the patterns as well, and they can tell whether it's from contact or cast off. And it was Bevel's opinion here that this was cast off pattern.
So we've talked a lot about the evidence of the crime scene, but some of the most powerful evidence in this case was actually on Darlie's body. And the folks who believe that Darlie is innocent will point to these injuries to say, look, nobody could have done this to themselves. This is obviously evidence of an attacker. And the question is it? Let's start with the bruising on Darlie. If you followed this case, you have seen a picture that was taken on June 10th, several days after the attack on June 6th, that Darlie released. It shows her arm, and it is almost completely black. We will put this picture up on the website so you can see it. But essentially, you have Darlie in this picture. She's holding her arm out, and really the entire bottom part of her arm is black. The top part of her arm is severely bruised. It's really one of the worst bruises I've ever seen, and this is presented as evidence that Darlie was attacked. But there are problems with this evidence. Despite how serious the injuries appear to be, they were not present when Darlie was admitted to the hospital for her other injuries, including the injury to her throat. And the doctor who treated her actually testified about this and said that these injuries were heavy, blunt trauma, and it was so bad that if he had seen them, he would have wanted to x-ray her arm. But when the doctor examined her after she came in, after the supposed attack, he did not see any evidence of this injury. And I will read to you from the transcript of the trial. Okay, anytime on the 6th, did you see any evidence of that type of injury to her right arm? None at all. The 7th? No. The 8th? No. Okay. Now, if that injury, that blunt trauma, had occurred on June 6th, about 2:30 in the morning, 1996, would you have seen evidence of that injury on her right arm, doctor? In my opinion, yes. This is a lot of blood. Yes. Okay. So you saw no evidence of that injury whatsoever? No. Another doctor, a Dr. Santos, who testified in this trial, testified that the wound was at most 24 to 48 hours old when the photograph was taken. Several nurses also testified that there was no evidence of this injury when Darlie was in the hospital. In fact, one of the nurses who bathed Darlie said that she had bathed that arm and Darlie had not complained of any pain despite the apparent seriousness of the injury. And it's not just the timing. The bruises don't really make any sense as defensive wounds. Prosecution witnesses testified about defensive bruising and what it looks like, and one simply would not expect to see the entire arm bruised up in an attack like this. Remember, Darlie was attacked by a knife, not a bat. Which raises another question. If Darlie was engaged in a struggle so severe as to cause this kind of bruising, where are the defensive cuts on her hands? When someone is fighting with someone who has a knife, you almost always see deep, to the bone cuts on the hands. It's a natural reaction. It seems weird, but it, I mean, just, go find a friend or something and tell them to act like they're stabbing you and see what you do. And what you will do is you will grab at the blade as it's coming towards you. It's just something you do. And when you know it, Darlie even said, she told one of her friends, that at some point she tried to grab the knife and her hand was cut, but the only injury on her hand was one that was described as a very minor paper cut by medical personnel. And Darlie had no blunt force trauma bruises to her body or her face, just on this arm. And another thing, and I have to come back to this, did Darlie get in a fight with this intruder or not? Because at times, it's as if she was in this struggle with this intruder, this to the death fight that resulted in all these wounds and her arms all bruised up. And other times, there was no struggle. There was no fight.
Think about her very first statement to police. Her statement to police was she woke up after she'd already been stabbed and her boys had been stabbed and the man was walking away. There is no struggle in that first statement, that story. And that is not consistent with when did she sustain this whole arm bruise. After the man was walking away, she ran after him with a slit throat, and then he turned around and beat her with the back of a knife, a bat. It's not exactly clear. And
then she forgot all that.
And then she forgot it and couldn't tell it to the police that night or a few days later during her statement.
And the weirdest thing about this, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, in her 911 call, the first transcript of her 911 call includes her saying, "I was fighting." And in trial, when she was confronted with that, she said, no, that's not what I said. I said, it was frightening. Because we can only assume one of two things is true. Either she wasn't fighting him and she just wanted to make sure the record was clear, or if she did this, she knew that if she fought the person, then the natural question is, well, if you fought him, why can't you tell us anything about him? So she couldn't have fought him. Well, then what about the bruises? Where do the bruises come in? And this theory that there must have been a first encounter with this person where all of this stuff happened and then she completely forgot it. Not just forgot the details, not just it's fuzzy, but has no recollection whatsoever of engaging with this person before her initial story to the police begins, where she wakes up on the couch. It's just very difficult to believe that's how that could have gone, but it almost has to be the case to explain these bruises. And this is yet another one of those things. It's like the sock, where when someone first talks about this, they show you this picture. And in fact, about a month ago, there was some discussion on the gallery, which is our Facebook page. A lot of great people on there. And someone brought up Darlie's case and asked people, what do you think? And somebody said, well, I think she did it. And one of the people posted this photograph and said, well, how do you explain this then? That doesn't look like somebody who did it to themselves. And when you just look at the photo, yeah, you're like, wow, yeah, that's some really serious bruising. But then when you actually think about the details, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense from her story, and it doesn't make any sense that she wouldn't have had some signs of this bruise when she went to the hospital the first time. And in fact, she has bruising from the night. By the time this picture is taken, that bruising is fading. It's turning, yellow like old bruises do. And yet this bruise looks completely fresh. And I'll just say this, whether she did this or not, whether there was an intruder or not, this bruise I think is self-inflicted.
So it's possible that is, I think what can be very clear from this is that whether it was self-inflicted or not, I don't think this bruise existed on the night of the attack. So therefore, if there were an attacker who killed the boys, this bruise is not from that attacker.
I think that's 100% right. However she got it, it wasn't from that. However it developed, it wasn't from that. At some point, she may have decided to use the bruise, whether she caused it to herself or whether somebody else did it to her, to try and bolster her story. You could imagine her doing that, even if she's innocent. People aren't believing her, and she feels like, oh my God, people are going to blame me for this. I need more evidence that I didn't do this. Maybe that's your story, but it almost has to be something like that. Because of all her injuries, this one makes the least sense.
I agree with you that this bruise, no matter what, no matter how it appeared or how it was inflicted upon her, was not inflicted by the attacker who killed the boys that night. How serious were Darlie's injuries then? We've talked about how we don't think this bruise occurred on the night of the murders. So what did Darlie suffer? It's been repeated ad nauseum that she came within 2 millimeters or 1/16 of an inch from having her carotid artery cut, of dying. And just so you know, the testimony was actually 2 to 3 millimeters, but that's like what, an extra 50%. So it's still very close. And of course, that's true. Put your fingers on your neck right now. Find your pulse. Do you feel it? The reason you can feel your pulse so well on your neck is that the carotid artery is both large and very close to the surface of the skin. In fact, the carotid artery is about 2 centimeters to 2.5 or 20 to 25 millimeters beneath the skin. We found a chart that had a colorful comparison of this. A centimeter in that chart was about the size of a ladybug. 2 centimeters was about the size of a penny. In other words, it's essentially impossible to cut your throat and not come very close to hitting your carotid artery. And remember, the neck is not like your chest. There's no huge bone protecting what's underneath it. That's why it's possible to choke someone to death, because your neck is a very exposed area of your body. There's a reason that so many neck slashes are described as almost decapitating someone, because there's just nothing standing in the way. With enough force, it's almost hard not to cut all the way through. And until you get to the spine, which is at the back of your neck, there's nothing but skin, blood, and muscle. So it's hard to believe that someone was slashed Darlie's throat while she was sleeping. So in other words, while she was not putting up any sort of a fight, and not kill her.
So Alice, before we continue, I don't want to say that covering all these true crime cases has made me paranoid, but I feel like I appreciate more than ever my privacy. And the last thing I want is someone following me around the internet. And that's where IPVanish VPN comes in. VPN is short for Virtual Private Network, and it is a super important tool that helps you safely browse the internet without someone watching what you're reading, what you're visiting, what you're searching for, and what you're doing.
Brett, I agree. It's important that what we're doing on the internet, it's really no one else's business but our own. And IPVanish helps you remain anonymous and secure on the internet. You can use this VPN on your computers, tablets, phones, even things like your Fire Stick. You may not have thought about that when you're streaming media. When you use a VPN, all your data is encrypted, so no one can tell what you are doing, watching, or searching. It is private.
And for listeners of the show, IPVanish is offering an incredible 65% off, just $3.49 for the first month or $31.49 for the year. So go to IPVanish.com/TP and claim your 65% savings. Like I said, those plans start at $3.49 or $31.49 a year. Join us. Protect yourself on the internet. Go to IPVanish.com/TP to get the deal and start protecting yourself online.
Experts at trial debated whether or not Darlie's wounds to her neck were superficial. The defense had the San Antonio medical examiner, Vincent DeMaio, testify that the injuries were nearly fatal and he'd never seen a self-inflicted wound like that before. But the experts on the prosecution side weren't hired guns or the prosecution's team members. They were her own doctors. And even DeMaio, on cross-examination, acknowledged that they were in a better position to evaluate Darlie's injuries than he was. So, what did those doctors say? Dr. Santos, who performed the surgery on Darlie, reported that he called for surgery in the first place because of all the things that can be damaged in the throat by such a cut. The larynx, the trachea, the large veins and arteries, there's just a lot of vulnerable, important things in your neck. But when the doctors ultimately cleaned out the wound and looked at it, they realized that the cut was superficial. He noted that the bleeding had come from some small veins underneath the skin that had been cut. Those were cauterized and stitched with no issue, and the cut itself only went down to the neck muscle, which, quote, had a little nick in it, but did not go beyond that. Happy to find that, the doctors washed out the wound and closed it up. And the doctor summed up by saying the cut went through skin and some fat, but no further. The medical description of such a wound is superficial. Dr. Dillon, who assisted in the surgery, concurred with Dr. Santos. So you can imagine these doctors, upon knowing that this woman is coming in after 2 other people on the scene were brutally murdered by stab wounds, sees a neck wound, knowing what could be exposed in the neck, and knowing that the killer had already killed the other 2 victims. They are moving quickly to essentially save her life. So the cost benefit of not going into surgery, I think they decided to go and have surgery. And it wasn't until they were in surgery that they decided this was actually just a superficial cut, and they didn't have to fix the larynx, the trachea, the large veins or arteries. They could just kind of stitch her up, and they were happy that the wound was not as serious as they initially feared.
A couple things I think are interesting about this testimony. The first thing is people argue about whether or not these are superficial wounds. And a lot of times people will sort of mock this, like, haha, it was superficial. Yeah, it only came within 2 millimeters of killing her. It was a superficial wound. As a medical fact, it was a superficial wound. Yes, it came within 2 millimeters of killing her. If it had been 2 millimeters deeper, it would no longer have been a superficial wound. The doctor testified to that. But the fact of the matter is, it was a superficial wound. Doesn't mean she wasn't stabbed by anybody, but that's just sort of the way it is. The other thing that's interesting about this is another one of those pieces of evidence that when you initially see it, like the bruise, like the sock, you're like, well, nobody would do that. Nobody would cut their own throat. And yet, when you look at the details, is this really consistent with someone else attacking her? You know, is it really possible that this person attacked Darlie, cut her throat, and this is as deep as they went? How in the world did they not cut her carotid artery? Like Alice said, we're not talking like a deep cut here. We're talking, the cut was less than, a penny? Isn't that what we said? That 2 centimeters, which is how deep you'd have to cut to get to the carotid artery, is about a penny. That is not a very deep cut. It's hard to imagine someone cutting in anger another person's throat and not going deeper than that. It almost feels like to me that the only way you could do this is if you were cutting yourself and wanting to make it seem serious, but not wanting to kill yourself. Or maybe you didn't care whether you killed yourself or not. Now, I'll say this. Darlie, and I hate to keep coming back to old Jeffrey McDonald, but if Darlie did this, she's got a lot more guts than he did. You know, Jeffrey McDonald, his self-inflicted wound was a tiny little cut to the chest that accidentally punctured his lungs. You know, this is serious. She went all in. It's consistent to me with the sock. You know, the sock thing is really dangerous. You're really taking a big risk there to leave the crime scene in the middle of the crime to drop off a sock just so you can throw police off in a different direction. But that is a risky thing to do that has a high possibility of reward. This is the same thing. This is a risky thing to do that has a high possibility of reward, and the reward is the same as the sock. It's making people think that you didn't do this, that someone else must have done this. The other thing I'll say about this, if you look at the wound, and we have a picture that we'll have online, and, you know, you've probably never done this before, but I want you to imagine you're going to cut your own throat. And And I just pantomime it for a second. Like, take the knife and cut your throat. And how does your hand move? Because the first time I did this, without even thinking about it, I did the exact same, starting at the top, downward cut that you see on Darlie's throat. That's what I did. I didn't cut straight. And in fact, if you try and cut straight, it's awkward. If you imagine you're holding a knife and you try and cut straight across your throat, it's an awkward motion. It's much more natural to sort of start up top at an angle and go straight down. Or not straight down, but at an angle, a slash, as it were.
There's a curve to it because your arm, think about like a hinge, right? It's hard to go straight across because your shoulder has a ball and socket that is attached very close to your neck.
Yeah, exactly. And when you do that, when you try and do it to yourself, I think you'll see that. I mean, look, one other interesting thing about this, and this actually, is something that you can apply to a lot of different cases. There were multiple experts that talked about this wound. Alice talked about that. The defense had a very good expert, very well credentialed expert, to come in and talk about this and essentially say the same argument that you've heard from Darlie's defenders. 2 more millimeters and this is deadly. 2 more millimeters and you cut the carotid artery and she bleeds out in a few minutes. And some people have said, well, if you have experts on both sides, how do you make a decision? Isn't that reasonable doubt in of itself? We heard this when we talked about the George Floyd case. There were experts on both sides talking about use of force. Some of them said the force was justified. Some said it wasn't. How do you make a decision? How do you decide which experts to believe? And then we talked about credibility. We talked about examining the testimony, comparing it. It actually is a lot of work to do it, but you can do it. And I think the interesting thing you have here, yes, she had an expert, but as Alice said, the experts for the prosecution were her own doctors. These weren't prosecution witnesses. They were just her doctors. They were the people who looked at the wound, who dealt with it firsthand. And when they saw it, they did not see a deadly wound. They saw a superficial wound. And is that consistent with the rest of the case? Is the other thing to ask yourself. And the way you can think about that is compare the wounds that Darlie had to the wounds of the boys. And when you look at the wounds of the boys, what you see are wounds that were meant to kill somebody. There's no question about these. Damon Routier had 4 deep stab wounds to his back. The stab wounds were so deep that they went into the chest muscles. So imagine that. We talked about much deeper than a penny. This is going all the way through his back, into his lungs, into the chest muscles. These are stab wounds that are delivered with force. Devin had 2 deep stab wounds in his chest. Much like the stab wounds on Damon, they were so deep that they went all the way to his back. And he also had a stab wound in his left thigh, and his left forearm was sliced open. So these are vicious.
Yeah, Brett, these are such vicious stabs that you can imagine there takes force, and so you have to pull your arm back, casting off blood most likely. It would be very difficult, in fact, to make such multiple deep stabs without drawing your arm back behind you to get enough force in order to come back down to be able to stab through the back to the chest and then to the chest to the back, which could explain cast off behind you on your back.
The problem with telling a story like this is you have to tell it a piece of the evidence at a time. And really, it's only at the end that you can wrap everything up and think about everything and see how it all fits. And when you see people trying to show that Darlie is innocent, they're trying to take down each piece of evidence. And sometimes, they succeed. Sometimes they make you think, well, I don't know. So take the cast off, right? Well, I don't know. Maybe it was just there was a lot of blood and she's trying to help her kids and that's why the blood's on her shirt. But then you look at the stab wounds, and like Alice said, these are stab wounds that are going to create cast off. You should expect to see that, and you do see it. And you see it on the back of Darlie's shirt. And those two things work together. And then you look at the seriousness of the stab wounds on the boys, and then you look at Darlie's wound, which, sure, 2 millimeters away from killing her, but it didn't go those 2 millimeters, did it? It only cut less than 2 centimeters into her throat. That was the cut to her throat. These stab wounds almost through and through. I mean, from the back to the front is what you're seeing. Against the boys. Against the least dangerous individuals in that room. Brutal stab wounds to them to make sure they are dead. And then with Darlie, you don't see that. With Darlie, there's a slash wound, and then for reasons that are absolutely inexplicable, the intruder leaves her alive and drops the knife and heads out. Why would he do that? Why are these wounds so different? Why are they stab wounds on the boys and not on Darlie? Remember, her own story is that she woke up on the couch when one of the boys woke her up. Why did this person cut her throat? Now, if they were in a fight, going back to the fight thing, you could imagine they're in a fight and this person is slashing, right? So they're not stabbing, they're slashing. And when they slash her throat. Well, you could imagine that happening. But in order for that to happen, once again, you have to have a fight. And we keep being told there wasn't a fight. We keep being told that she woke up on the couch. So we go back to this sort of, this fight that had to happen that didn't wake anybody up upstairs. The dog didn't bark. And she doesn't remember. That all had to happen for these stab wounds to happen. So when you look at the injuries, it raises a lot of questions for me about Darlie and her defense. We got a lot more to talk about, though. And some of it's going to be helpful for Darlie, and some of it's not. We're going to talk about evidence of an intruder. We're going to talk about some fingerprints that nobody knows where they came from, or is that evidence that there was somebody else in this house? We're going to talk about this window, and is it possible to go in and out of this window without disturbing anything or not? Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. And, we'll talk about a lot of other things in this case. Does Darlie have a motive? I mean, that's one thing people point to a lot. Why would she do this? We talked about the intruder and what their motive could be. But what about Darlie? What motive would Darlie possibly have to kill two of her kids, but leave her husband alive and leave her youngest child alive? Not really consistent with what you think about when you think about a family annihilator. They usually annihilate their family. And here, there's only two people who are killed. So what's going on there? We're going to talk about all of that and more when we come back next week. There's so much in this case. And, we're moving through it quickly. I think we've cut down on the back and forth because we wanted to move through this quickly. We didn't want to, drag this out any longer than we had to because we wanted to get all the information you guys. But there's so much information in this case. And I feel like there's so much information in this case that you haven't really heard before and that gets left out in a lot of the other tellings of the story. So I wanted you to have it all so you could make your own decision about what you think happened in this case. I'm sure you have thoughts already. Thoughts, questions, comments, criticisms. Hit us up at ProsecutorsPod on all your social media, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. If you want to shoot us an email, you can also look us up on YouTube and leave a message there. Or if you want to join our Patreon page, there's a lot of back and forth on there. And go to the gallery on Facebook and join the community there to talk about this case and anything else you want to talk about when it comes to true crime. Just go ahead and give you guys an update on how things are going here. The baby is eating, which is really great, and we're able to hold him and feed him, which is a big, big step in the right direction. And we are hopeful that if he continues to improve, that soon, maybe in a couple weeks, we'll actually be able to bring him home, which obviously will be amazing if and when that happens. So thank you guys for all your prayers. He is getting stronger every day, and I just, as I've said before, and I'm not going to dwell on it, I'm so thankful for all the support that we've gotten from everybody.
That's such great news, Brett. Thank you for sharing. We are all rooting for baby boy, and he is a fighter, but, no shock there seeing who his parents are.
He is. He's so cute, too. He's like this little bundle of cuteness. So I like to, I can't get over how cute he is. But anyways, well, look, guys, this has been depressing, frankly. I would say fun, but it's been mostly depressing. But we've enjoyed talking about this with you this week. We'll be back next week with more on this case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors.
had so much fun.
Did you?
I could have made it a lot worse, but I did not.
Oh man, that's funny. Okie dokie, artichoke. Let's do this. All right, let's do this. Okay. Hey, we've only got 11 pages to go with the outline.
No, I mean I'm not.
We're
complaining,
moving through
just
it,
like,
though.
goodness, this isn't like an